It was the Aussies' first major divisional level operation of the Vietnam War. Supporting the Americans, the Australians from 1 RAR would find themselves flown into the heart of insurgent territory, facing ambushes, booby traps, and an unseen enemy operating beneath their very feet. For the first time, Australian engineers would find themselves thrust into a deadly, dark, and underground world. Operation Crimp became known to the outside world and to history as the Battle of Hobo Woods, but to the GIs and diggers on the ground, it became known as the Human Anthill. However, rather than an anthill, when the diggers flew in, they stirred up a hornet's nest. Before we delve into the operation itself, it's important to understand how the Australians on 1 RAR got here in the first place. Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War began in 1962 with the deployment of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. In April 1965, Australia received a further request for military assistance from the South Vietnamese government. Responding to the request, the Australian government decided to deploy the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. The main force of infantrymen from 1 RAR arrived in June 1965. The battalion was stationed at the US Bien Hoa Air Base just north of Saigon. Attached to the US 173rd Airborne Brigade, their task was to guard the air base that was operated by the Americans. The Australians employed their doctrine of aggressive patrolling in the locality. Soon, 1 RAR reduced enemy activity in the immediate area of the base to an all-time low. In September 65, the Australian government relaxed operational restrictions on the armed forces in Vietnam. This allowed 1 RAR finally to operate as a manoeuvre battalion and conduct missions outside the environment of the base area. Unleashed, the diggers were finally given the opportunity to show the enemy what they were capable of. 1 RAR were experienced and capable jungle soldiers. Their junior troops had been mentored by senior NCOs of high calibre and experience, such as the heroic Kevin Dasher-Wheatley VC, who had been a platoon sergeant in 1 RAR before joining the legendary Australia Army Training Team Vietnam. The diggers were highly trained, confident and prepared to take on the Viet Cong. With the restrictions off, the Aussies would participate in the smaller scale Operation Hump in November 1965 and Operation Marauder in the Mekong Delta in the week leading up to Operation Crimp in early January 1966. Although A Company 1 RAR would see some action in Operation Hump, both operations were much smaller in scale than Operation Crimp. Soon, the Australians would have more than their fair share of combat. Involving 2 brigades, Operation Crimp was the first major search and destroy operation involving Australian troops in Vietnam. It lasted from the 8th to the 14th of January 1966, approximately a week. A joint US-Australian military operation, its key objective was to target the Saigon Viet Cong military and political headquarters for the 4th Military Region, believed to be hidden in the Hobo Woods. These woods were located in Binh Duong province, 20 kilometres north of Cu Chi, and around 60 kilometres or so north of Saigon. The Hobo Woods would consist of dense woodland and adjacent rubber plantations and open rice paddies. Extremely large dikes, some 1 to 2 metres high, and vegetation would also occur towards the Saigon River. The eastern boundary of the area of operations was the Saigon River. The notorious Iron Triangle lay to the east side of the riverbank. Today, it's been built up, and it's really hard to convey the terrain at the time. Whilst looking at a modern-day map of the area, nearby to the AOR, I saw a glamping site. I thought that was something that you only saw in the Cotswolds. The Viet Cong would plan attacks on Saigon from this headquarters and use the locality as a staging area for operations in the capital. Unknown to the planners, the area also housed the Cu Chi Military HQ. Under the overall command of the 1st Infantry Division, who contributed a brigade, the operation would also include the 173rd Airborne Brigade. The 1st Infantry Division was known as the Big Red One, and we covered this outfit before with my Real Life Heroes video on Medal of Honor recipient James Buddha Bonsteel. Using airborne and ground troops, the mission hoped to flush out Viet Cong from the Hobo Woods and surrounding areas, forcing them up to the Saigon River where they would be trapped. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had 2 airborne infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd 503rd, an artillery battalion with 105mm howitzers, a supply battalion and several specialist units. 1 RAR was the 3rd Infantry Unit in the brigade. Supporting them were the Aussies of 105 Battery, Kiwi 161 Battery and 3 Field Troop, the 1st Australian Engineering Unit to be sent to Vietnam to support 1 RAR. Expecting a risky but routine deployment of road clearing, demolishing enemy fortifications, clearing caches and demining, the engineers would be in for a shock. In the operation, the 1st Infantry Division's 3rd Infantry Brigade's AOR, or Area of Responsibility, would be the south sector of the Hobo Woods locality. The 173rd Airborne, including 1 RAR, would focus on the northern sector. The 3rd Infantry would arrive from the west as mechanised infantry and some by chopper, pushing the enemy to the river. For these soldiers from the Big Red One, from a purely kinetic engagement perspective, their AOR would be largely uneventful, aside from uncovering a medical outpost and a small base camp. Their main foe would be IEDs. Alerted by their advance, the enemy had abandoned many positions, leaving dense fields of mines and booby traps. Although OPSEC was a priority, there is evidence that either a radio intercept or informers in the South Vietnamese military tipped off the Viet Cong about the upcoming operation. Hence why much of the southern sector was deserted. For the Australian and US airborne troops, flying in by chopper but without the element of surprise, their experiences in the northern AO would be far less subdued than their comrades operating in the south with the 3rd Infantry Brigade. Just before liftoff, IMINT revealed the enemy had prepared an ambush at the originally planned landing zone. The Australians were then lifted to an alternative site to the southwest of the original landing zone. They were to then patrol to the original LZ to secure it. The plan was that 1 RAR would land at LZ March, secure the original LZ, and then finally establish a blocking position in a village beside the river on the northern edge of the 173rd's area of operations. Behind the Australians, landing at LZ April and May, the 503rd troops would then drive east and flush out any VC towards the diggers. I just want to clarify one thing here. The Australians and US Army used vastly different methods of patrolling. 1 RAR would move silently through the jungle, avoiding tracks and roads. The airborne troops, however, would use noise and firepower to attempt to draw the enemy towards them. There's no right or wrong method, they're just both very different. This doctrinal difference, which had been identified since the Aussies arrived, would eventually lead to the establishment of the ATF, or Australian Task Force, in the Rhone province, and Australian units acting autonomously, not under US command. I've heard the Green Berets and the US Marines TTPs were more similar in Vietnam to the Australians. If anyone can confirm that, please let me know in the comments, as I'm not 100% sure. The Australian infantry was armed with 9mm Owen guns, 7.62mm SLRs and M60 machine guns. Equipment included World War II era packs and webbing and tropical studded boots and gaiters. The training, the enthusiasm, the will to win and the overall morale was high. But, unlike the Americans, who generally had all the gear, much equipment for the Australians was lacking. Even more critical for the Australians, beer was in short supply during the first few weeks of the deployment, unless a trip could be arranged to the Gunslingers Club in Bien Hoa Air Base. Is that the Special Forces compound? I've heard unconfirmed rumours that that's where usually the illicit booze could be found. Returning to the operations, 1 RAR spearheaded the 173rd's assault. US B-52 bombers opened up on the ground, bombing the area, hoping to soften up any resistance and reduce ground fire at the airborne troops. Arriving directly behind the B-52s at around 0900 hours, the Aussies hit the deck at the alternative landing zone march in an old rubber plantation. The landing was uncontested, although they encountered light resistance from a machine gun located in a house nearby. Seeing that it contained women and children, one RAR refrained from firing and the Viet Cong escaped. The diggers then moved out to their assigned position. Arriving at the original landing zone at lunchtime, at 12:20 hours, a lead platoon was ambushed from a bunkered and booby-trapped position. Taking several casualties, the diggers decided to assault the bunker. However, more men were shot down. When the soldiers eventually reached the bunker, they realised the VC had melted away, taking their casualties with them in the firefight, as no bodies were found. Looking at the after-action report, it appears 2 men were killed and 6 wounded. One was a medic who was shot down while treating others. It just shows you what a risky job that is. As the afternoon and evening wore on, the infantrymen found themselves in further contacts, receiving mortar and sniper fire. To the commanders, it was clear that the Australians had stumbled onto something significant, and the Viet Cong were fighting in defence of something of great value. By the end of the first day, the Aussies had suffered 3 dead and 15 wounded. A forward artillery observer from 105 Battery was also killed, the first Australian officer killed in Vietnam. Arriving at the planned blocking position, the Aussies tried to settle in for the night, but were kept awake by strange scraping, scuffling and digging noises. Occasionally, they'd see shadowy figures moving around in the night. Initially, it was unclear what the cause of the sounds were. In the book First to Fight by Bob Breen, he describes the following. As night fell, one RAR was on a human anthill. From below ground, the diggers could hear constant scuffling noises, digging sounds and Vietnamese voices. After they had finished digging their fighting trenches, these sounds appeared to be even closer. Every now and then, a VC would come to the surface and crawl away. The diggers would hear the noises, but were under strict orders not to fire unless an enemy was positively identified. Above ground were the pathetic sounds of hundreds of women and children crying, probably lamenting the fate of their husbands, fathers and sons, who were trapped in the tunnels below the battalion. In the darkness, enemy infiltration attempts would occur, and the diggers would have to resort to grenades forward of the perimeter for fear of giving away their positions or friendly fire. In the dawn light, troops investigating the source of the strange noises overnight discovered something startling. Tunnel entrances and spider holes all around them. One RAR were camped over a major enemy tunnel complex, which was the VC military HQ. Aussie engineers would be called on to go down these tunnels. 3 field troop deployed on the operation would be the ones called upon. These engineers expected routine but dangerous jobs of road clearing, demining, or destroying caches and enemy facilities such as bunkers. However, now they would be on the receiving end of one of the nastiest and most terrifying jobs of the war, becoming tunnel rats. Armed with just a pistol and a bayonet, US and Australian tunnel rats would lower themselves into these complexes. On their own, with no backup and in the darkness, they were facing the unknown. Here is a quote from one Australian sapper made in 1969 describing the experience. No one is going to force you to do this kind of stuff. So if it's not for you, ask for a transfer. But if you decide to stay though, you've got to believe, and I mean really believe, that you're already dead. Tunnel rat casualty rates are ridiculously high, so it's not too hard to believe. Once you accept you're a dead man walking, the job gets much easier. It even becomes a challenge. Nothing to do with the army, it's a personal thing. I actually visited the Cu Chi tunnels as a tourist some years ago. Even though they've widened them for Westerners, you still get some sense of how claustrophobic, humid and horrible the conditions were down there. To me, it seems like the worst job in the world to be a tunnel rat, and I've got nothing but the greatest of respect for those brave men that went down there. Starting from the 9th of January, the engineers who were exploring the tunnels would go on to uncover a hoard of intelligence documents. At least 100,000 pages of documents were found. The papers exposed the enemy's organisation structure and revealed the names of every Communist Party member in South Vietnam. Also included were target folders for military installations in Saigon, as well as a list of new targets to be investigated. In addition to details of US units stationed around the region, they even had the names and addresses of some US personnel who lived in the capital. Sadly, after the operation, the South Vietnamese armed forces took sole custody of the documents and failed to exploit them for further timely intelligence. To highlight the extraordinary risk these Australian engineers faced, I'm going to read an extract about Operation Crimp from Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Pope's article, Australian Tunnel Rats in Vietnam. From one entrance, an enemy soldier had killed 2 Australian soldiers and wounded 2 others. Although untrained for the task, and despite the obvious danger, volunteers entered the 60 centimetres wide and 70 centimetres high, lightless, claustrophobic and almost airless tunnel, armed with just a flashlight, a bayonet and a lot of courage. The complex had been evacuated very recently, but what they recovered was an intelligence bonanza. Thus began the Australians' unintentional career as tunnel rats. What's most surprising, given the wealth of previous tunnel clearance experience from the French era, neither South Vietnamese sappers nor US troops had passed any lessons learned or operational techniques on to the Australian field engineers. The 3 field troop sappers were therefore totally untrained and unprepared for this unexpected role. The consequences of this was soon felt. Sadly, one Australian engineer died on the 4th day of operations, suffocated in the tunnels. Pope states, "The deadly realities of war have been brought home to the troop, yet none refused to continue to enter the tunnels when required." In their work, the engineers uncovered a vast underground complex consisting of hospitals, kitchens, munition shops and living areas. Here's an illustrated example. From the 10th to the 14th, the operation continued, with sporadic encounters with Viet Cong guerrillas and US and Australian troops uncovering more tunnels and large caches containing rice and weapons. Viet Cong fighters would make contact with US and Australian units, fight and then withdraw, disappearing into the ground. The Communists relied on rapid mobility, concealment and the element of surprise to compensate for lack of firepower and numbers. Enemy troops would appear within the US or Australian camp perimeters and behind patrolling soldiers, attack the troops and quickly disappear again. This pattern would continue throughout the life cycle of Operation Crimp. It seems to me like a deadly game of whack-a-mole. A Viet Cong officer described fighting the Americans in the Hobo Woods. "We waited until they were very close. We were in our spider hole firing positions. The Americans never saw us at all. I ordered my men to fire and 1 GI fell down. The others just stood around looking at him. They did not even know where the bullet had come from. We kept shooting. Although their fellows kept falling down, they kept on advancing. That takes courage. Then they called for artillery. When the first shells came, we simply went into the tunnels and went to another place." It's just incredible the determination, courage and willpower the Viet Cong fighters had to live in these filthy, disease-ridden tunnels, waiting hours and days to ambush their opponents and risking death from bombing raids or a terrible fate sealed in a tunnel. On the night of the 11th, the 3rd Infantry Brigade ended their operation in the south and withdrew. Having had minimal contact with the enemy, they managed to complete all their missions within 72 hours. They lost 6 dead and over 40 injured, mainly through booby traps. In addition to sniper attacks, ambushes, tripwires and mines, troops in the Hobo Woods also had to face deadly punji traps. These sharpened wooden or bamboo stakes, often placed in concealed pits or along trails, were designed to injure enemy soldiers. The sticks were often covered in excrement or poison as to encourage infection. This was not unique to Vietnam. We saw this used in Burma in the 19th century against British and Indian troops in earlier videos. I've heard of various pronunciations of this weapon, but I'm just going to keep to punji. So punji sticks were designed to injure a man, not to kill him. Just think, a wounded man would fix your enemy position into place. It would require at least a squad to protect him, therefore eroding the resources of your enemy if they are attacking. Also, it would reduce their operational cadence or tempo, fixing them into a position that you could potentially ambush. But the big prize was the medevac. With a wounded soldier, troops were called in a helicopter to evacuate him. Viet Cong would then target the nearby landing zone, so when the helicopter came down to pick up the soldier, they could then take it down with RPG fire. That was the big prize. It's estimated that punji sticks or similar traps wounded a total of 2% of American soldier casualties during the Vietnam War. On the 14th of January, the final US troops and one RAR returned to base and the operation concluded. In Operation Crimp, one RAR had faced the toughest resistance out of all the units that participated. For their part, the Australians had gathered a treasure trove of intelligence documents, and the engineers had mapped out around 17 kilometres of tunnels under their positions. This was done by sappers taking telephone lines down the tunnels with them, and by measuring the length of the line and recording the changes of direction with a compass. They were able to determine the routes of many tunnels. To highlight what a dangerous job it was, during the course of the Vietnam War, 35 Australian sappers would lose their lives. 200 more were wounded. A 36% casualty rate. The Engineer Field Troops reportedly were awarded just 5 military medals and 1 military cross between 1965 and 71. To me, this seems pretty low for a unit that incurred such high casualties from constantly operating in a high-risk environment. The operation was deemed by MACV Command an overwhelming success, having destroyed numerous food and weapons caches and identified the enemy's use of major tunnel systems. It was also understood by senior command that a dedicated unit of trained tunnel engineers needed to be established. Despite uncovering such a massive network, the operation was only a partial success, with the region still continuing to be used as a major Viet Cong logistics network. Over 200 kilometres of tunnels would go on to play a key role in enabling the Viet Cong to launch a surprise Tet offensive in 1968. Incredibly, the tunnels would even stretch to the Cambodian border. In 1970, the US put an end to the tunnels, with B-52s dropping thousands of delayed fuse bombs that buried deep into the ground before exploding, killing an unknown number of Viet Cong. In total, US and Australian forces claimed just under 300 enemy dead. Nearly 130 of those were confirmed. Over 90 POWs were also captured. For the Aussies, 8 soldiers were killed and 29 wounded. I've heard another source say 9 soldiers were killed. For the Americans in total, 14 soldiers were killed and 76 wounded. The majority of American casualties came from booby traps. This large-scale assault marked the real substantial beginning of Australia's direct combat role in Vietnam and showcased their expertise in jungle warfare. 1 RAR in total for their whole tour were awarded 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 3 members of the British Empire, 9 military medals, 4 British Empire medals, and 10 mentioned in dispatches. I've not been able to see a specific list of medal awards for Crimp, but being a medal channel, it would be improper if I didn't show the various medals that were awarded to Australian units operating in the Vietnam War during this period. Victoria Cross, Medal for Gallantry, Distinguished Service Order, Military Cross, Member of the British Empire, military version, Distinguished Conduct Medal, British Empire Medal, military version, Military Medal, Australia Active Service Medal, Vietnam Medal, Australian Defence Medal, and 2 foreign awards, the Vietnam Gallantry Cross with Palm and Vietnam Campaign Medal. Veterans of this campaign may have been awarded a selection of these. Having just had Anzac Day pass recently, I thought it would be interesting to do this video highlighting another lesser known battle in Vietnam. The veterans of these campaigns aren't getting any younger, so it's important to keep their history and memories alive. I've used a variety of sources for this video, including the Cove website, Hardtack Podcast, First to Fight by Bob Breen, and the Australian War Memorial website. It has been difficult as some sources conflict with each other, and there are various narratives or different facts and figures, but I've tried my best to discern what the most accurate ones are or the most credible sources. Seeing as how the diggers had a shortage of beer during the first few weeks of this deployment, if you see a veteran of this campaign, why not buy them a schooner? I'm sure they've deserved it. Thanks for watching. I hope you find some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.